The ballroom of the Langford Grand Hotel glittered like a kingdom built for people who had never once doubted their own importance. Crystal chandeliers scattered gold across marble floors, polished so perfectly they reflected the expensive heels and tailored tuxedos moving through the room like choreographed power. Waiters in white gloves drifted between executives carrying champagne towers, while a string quartet played softly beneath the roar of strategic laughter and carefully rehearsed conversations. Every person in the room understood the unspoken rules of Bennett and Rowe Holdings. Who mattered, who didn't, who deserved attention, who should remain invisible. And tonight, Sophie Bennett stood directly in the center of that invisible category. She held a champagne glass she had barely touched and remained near the far edge of the ballroom beside a towering arrangement of white orchids, pretending to read something on her phone, while conversation circles quietly closed every time she approached them. She noticed it the same way people noticed cold air slipping under a door. Small, constant, deliberate. A senior marketing director smiled politely at her before immediately turning his shoulders away. Two women from finance lowered their voices the second Sophie stepped near them. Someone even took the empty seat beside her rather than the one directly across from her, forcing an awkward gap at the table that everyone pretended not to notice. Sophie had spent 3 years at Bennett & Rowe learning how exclusion worked inside powerful companies. Nobody insulted you directly. That would be crude. Instead, they erased you carefully, efficiently, like deleting a line from a spreadsheet. She adjusted the sleeve of her dark emerald gown and forced herself to breathe normally. Her babysitter had canceled twice before finally agreeing to stay late tonight. Her son Noah had begged her not to go because he hated when she came home looking exhausted after corporate events. "They don't deserve you, Mom," he had said while sitting cross-legged on the kitchen counter eating macaroni from the pot. She had laughed softly, then kissed his forehead, because children always believed their parents were stronger than they really were. But standing here now beneath the glow of 1,000 expensive lights, Sophie could already feel the old ache returning. The familiar certainty that no matter how hard she worked, no matter how many failing projects she rescued behind the scenes, this company would never truly see her. Not as important, not as worthy, not as someone who belonged in rooms like this. Across the ballroom, Claire Whitmore stood surrounded by vice presidents and board members like a queen holding court. Elegant silver dress, perfect posture, perfect smile. Claire had mastered the art of social dominance so completely that entire departments adjusted themselves around her moods. She spotted Sophie standing alone and gave a small, sympathetic smile that somehow felt crueler than open mockery. Then Claire turned away deliberately, drawing her circle tighter. Sophie lowered her eyes before anyone could see the hurt flicker across her face. She told herself it didn't matter. She was here for appearances. Smile politely. Stay 1 hour. Go home to Noah. That was the plan. Then the ballroom shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in the subtle way powerful rooms always change when someone important enters them. Conversations slowed. Several executives straightened instinctively. Heads turned toward the entrance. Adrian Cole had arrived. The CFO of Bennett & Rowe rarely attended social events unless absolutely necessary, which only added to the strange mythology surrounding him. At 38, Adrian carried the kind of quiet authority that made louder men nervous. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a perfectly cut black tuxedo, he moved through the ballroom with calm restraint instead of performance. People respected him because he never chased attention, yet somehow commanded all of it anyway. Sophie had only spoken to him twice in 3 years. Both times had been brief. Both times he had looked directly at her while she spoke something surprisingly few executives ever did. Rumors followed Adrian constantly. Widower, single father, genius with numbers, impossible to manipulate. Board members feared him because he could dismantle entire financial strategies with a few sentences delivered in that calm, steady voice. Women admired him because he never seemed to notice when they did. Claire Whitmore immediately crossed the ballroom toward him with practiced elegance, already smiling before she reached him. Several others followed close behind, eager to position themselves near the most respected executive in the company. Sophie watched from across the room and looked away quickly. Men like Adrian Cole existed in different worlds from women like her. He would spend the evening with the board. She would remain invisible beside the orchids until she could leave without seeming rude. A waiter passed with fresh champagne. Sophie reached automatically for another glass, mostly so her hands would have something to do. She heard laughter behind her, heard someone whisper her name followed by the phrase, "Poor thing." Her chest tightened. She stared down at the bubbles rising inside the crystal flute and silently counted backward from 10 the way she always did when anxiety threatened to climb into her throat. 1, 2, 3. Then suddenly the noise around her faded. Not completely, just enough for her instincts to notice movement nearby. Sophie looked up. Adrian Cole was walking directly toward her. Not toward Claire. Not toward the executive tables. Toward her. Several conversations visibly stalled as people tracked his movement across the ballroom. Sophie instinctively glanced behind herself as if perhaps he intended to speak to someone else. But there was nobody there. Adrian stopped beside her table. Up close, he looked even more intimidating. Not because he appeared cold. Quite the opposite. There was something deeply observant in his eyes, something unsettlingly attentive, as though he noticed details other people ignored. Sophie opened her mouth to greet him politely, but before she could speak, Adrian pulled out the empty chair beside her and sat down. The silence that followed spread through the ballroom like spilled wine. Sophie actually heard someone drop a fork near the center tables. Adrian rested one arm casually against the chair and glanced toward the untouched seat beside Sophie. "Interesting," he said calmly. Sophie blinked. "I'm sorry." His gaze moved briefly across the room where executives quickly pretended not to stare. A ballroom filled with ambitious people, he said. And somehow nobody chose the seat beside the most intelligent woman here. Heat rushed into Sophie's face so quickly she almost forgot how to breathe. Around them nearby, conversations completely died. Claire Whitmore stood frozen beside the bar, her expression tightening almost imperceptibly. Sophie gave a nervous laugh. "You don't have to say things like that." Adrian studied her quietly for a moment. "Yes," he said softly. "I do." The answer landed harder than she expected, because he didn't sound flirtatious. He sounded sincere. That was what made it dangerous. Sophie glanced down at her champagne glass. People are staring. Adrian looked around the ballroom once before taking a slow sip from the whiskey a waiter handed him moments earlier. Let them. She almost smiled despite herself. Almost. But years of corporate survival had trained her to remain careful. "Mr. Cole, Adrian." "Adrian," she corrected hesitantly. "You really don't need to rescue me." Something shifted in his expression then. Not pity. Recognition. "I know," he said quietly. "That's why I came over." Sophie looked at him fully for the first time that evening. And suddenly the ballroom no longer felt quite so cold. Adrian leaned back slightly in his chair while the orchestra shifted into a slower arrangement near the dance floor. "You know what fascinates me about rooms like this?" he asked. Sophie shook her head carefully. "Everyone here spends enormous amounts of energy trying to stand near power." His eyes moved briefly across the ballroom. "But almost nobody notices character?" Sophie swallowed hard. "You barely know me." Adrian's gaze returned to her face. "I know you stayed 3 nights rebuilding the Morgan account projections after your entire team went home." Sophie stared at him in shock. "I know you let your supervisor take credit because you didn't want 3 junior analysts fired for missing deadlines." Her pulse quickened. Nobody was supposed to know that. Adrian continued calmly. "And I know every executive in this room praises loyalty while quietly isolating one of the few genuinely decent people in the company." Sophie's throat tightened unexpectedly. She looked away quickly before emotion reached her eyes. Because the truth was she had stopped expecting anyone to notice her sacrifices a long time ago. Single mothers learned early that survival required invisibility. At work, in public, even in relationships. You became useful instead of valued. Reliable instead of chosen. She forced a composed smile. You make me sound more impressive than I am. Adrian's answer came immediately. No. They just trained you to shrink yourself. The words hit somewhere painfully deep inside her chest. Before Sophie could respond, Claire Whitmore approached their table wearing a polished smile sharp enough to cut glass. Adrian Claire said smoothly, "The board's asking for you." Adrian didn't look up immediately. "They'll survive 5 minutes without me." Claire's eyes flickered toward Sophie briefly. "We were just discussing next quarter's acquisition strategy." "Were you?" Adrian asked mildly. Claire ignored the subtle challenge in his tone. "Sophie, I didn't realize you'd be sitting here." Sophie heard it clearly, the implication. This table was not meant for her. Adrian heard it too. He slowly placed his glass down and finally lifted his eyes toward Claire. Actually, he said evenly, "I chose this table." The tension that followed became almost physical. Claire recovered quickly with a tight smile. "Of course." Adrian leaned back slightly. "You should join us if you'd like." Claire blinked once. The invitation caught her off guard because declining would appear petty, while accepting meant surrendering control of the social dynamic. Maybe later she answered before walking away gracefully. Sophie exhaled shakily the second Claire disappeared. "You really shouldn't antagonize her because of me." Adrian looked amused. "You think this is about you?" Sophie frowned slightly. Adrian's expression softened. "Sophie, people like Claire build entire systems around making others feel small. The moment someone refuses to participate, the illusion cracks." She stared at him quietly. "Why do you care?" For the first time that evening, Adrian hesitated before answering. Then he glanced toward the dance floor where couples moved beneath warm, golden light. "Because my daughter came home crying last year after sitting alone at lunch for 2 weeks. Sophie's chest tightened instantly. Adrian's voice remained calm but lower now. "Kids can be cruel quietly. Adults are worse because they hide it behind manners." Sophie felt emotion rise unexpectedly in her throat again. "What happened?" "I asked Lily why she never told me." A faint sadness crossed his face. "She said she didn't want to make anyone uncomfortable." Sophie closed her eyes briefly. God, she understood that feeling too well. Adrian looked at her carefully then. "You have the exact same expression she had." Sophie laughed weakly while fighting tears. "That's probably the saddest thing anyone's ever said to me." Adrian's mouth curved slightly for the first time all evening. Not a corporate smile. A real one. Warm, tired, human. Maybe he admitted. But it's honest. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Around them, the ballroom slowly resumed movement, though Sophie could still feel eyes watching from every direction. Yet somehow the humiliation no longer pressed against her chest the same way it had before. Because Adrian wasn't treating her like charity. He was treating her like she mattered, and that difference changed everything. Then the orchestra transitioned into a classic jazz piece, and Adrian stood slowly from his chair. Sophie looked up at him in confusion. He extended his hand toward her. The entire ballroom seemed to freeze again. "Dance with me," he said simply. Sophie's heart nearly stopped. "Adrian, you can say no." His voice remained gentle. "But you shouldn't say no because you're afraid of people watching." She looked around the room, executives pretending not to stare. Claire standing rigid near the bar. Whispered speculation already beginning to spread through the ballroom. One dance with Adrian Cole would become tomorrow morning's biggest corporate rumor. She knew that. He knew it too. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered. Adrian's eyes never left hers. "Because you looked like the only honest person in this room." Sophie felt something inside her crack open then. Not dramatically, quietly, like ice beginning to thaw after years of winter. Slowly, before fear could stop her, she placed her hand in his. And across the glittering ballroom of Bennett Rowe Holdings, the most powerful man in the company led the most invisible woman in the room onto the dance floor while an entire corporate empire watched in stunned silence. The moment Sophie placed her hand in Adrian Cole's, the atmosphere inside the ballroom changed in a way nobody could quite explain afterward. It wasn't loud. There was no dramatic confrontation or public announcement. Yet the room shifted around them with the strange electricity that appears whenever someone quietly breaks a rule everyone else has obeyed for years. Adrian guided her onto the dance floor with calm confidence, while dozens of executives watched from behind crystal glasses and carefully controlled expressions. Sophie could practically hear the speculation forming in real time. Why her? What was Adrian doing? Was this pity politics scandal? But Adrian moved as though none of it existed. His hand rested lightly against her back, respectful and steady, never possessive, never performative. And for the first time in years, Sophie realized how exhausting it had been to constantly brace herself around people. "You're tense," Adrian murmured as they moved slowly beneath the chandelier light. Sophie gave a nervous laugh. "Half the company looks ready to faint." "That's because half the company mistakes cruelty for professionalism." Sophie glanced up at him. "You really don't care what they think." Adrian's expression softened slightly. "That stopped being possible after my wife died." The honesty in his voice startled her. There was no self-pity there. Just truth, quiet and heavy. Sophie looked down briefly. "I'm sorry." Adrian nodded once. "Thank you." The orchestra continued playing while couples rotated around them in elegant circles, but Sophie barely noticed any of it anymore. She became aware instead of small things, the steadiness of Adrian's breathing, the way he guided without controlling, the strange calm she felt standing beside him. Most powerful men she had encountered spent conversations trying to prove something, their status, their intelligence, their dominance. Adrian did the opposite. He listened, truly listened, and somehow that felt far more dangerous. "You know," Adrian said after a moment, "you apologize before almost every sentence." Sophie blinked. "What you soften everything you say before you say it." His gaze stayed on her calmly. "Like you're preparing people to dismiss you." Her chest tightened unexpectedly. "I didn't realize I did that." Most people don't realize when survival habits become personality traits. Sophie looked away before he could see how deeply that sentence landed. Because the truth was, she had spent most of her adult life making herself smaller for other people's comfort. After her divorce, after Noah was born. After nights of balancing spreadsheets at her kitchen table while trying not to cry from exhaustion, she had slowly learned that the world rewarded women who demanded nothing, especially single mothers. You worked harder, spoke softer, accepted less. And eventually, people stopped seeing you altogether. Adrian seemed to sense the direction of her thoughts because his voice gentled further. "You don't have to disappear around me." Sophie swallowed hard. The music ended moments later, but neither of them moved immediately. Around the ballroom, conversations resumed in cautious waves while executives pretended not to stare too openly. Adrian stepped back slightly, though his eyes remained on her face. "Would you like some air?" he asked. Sophie nodded before she could overthink it. Adrian led her through a side corridor toward a private terrace overlooking Manhattan. The cold night air hit Sophie's skin gently the second they stepped outside. Below them, the city glittered endlessly beneath the dark sky, all movement and light and noise. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. The silence felt comfortable instead of awkward. Sophie rested both hands against the balcony railing and exhaled slowly. "I almost didn't come tonight," she admitted quietly. Adrian leaned one shoulder against the stone column beside her. "What changed your mind?" She laughed softly. "My son told me I should stop hiding from people who don't matter." Adrian smiled faintly. Smart kid. Too smart sometimes. Her expression softened automatically at the mention of Noah. He's 9 and already acts like he's 40. Adrian's gaze lingered on her face for a moment. Single-parent households do that to children. Sophie looked toward him again. How old is your daughter? 8. Something warmer entered his expression now. Lily. The way he said her name carried unmistakable love beneath the exhaustion. Sophie smiled faintly. What's she like? Adrian actually laughed quietly, then surprising her. Opinionated. Stubborn. Completely unimpressed by my job. Sophie laughed too, the sound escaping before she realized it. Real laughter. Adrian noticed. She could tell he noticed because something in his eyes softened further. That's the first genuine laugh I've heard from you tonight, he said. Sophie looked embarrassed immediately. Sorry. Adrian raised an eyebrow. There it is again. She blinked. What? Apologizing for existing. Heat rose into her cheeks. I don't do that. Adrian gave her a look that clearly said otherwise. Sophie shook her head with reluctant amusement. Okay, maybe a little. A lot. For the first time that evening, Sophie felt herself relax completely. Not because the room inside had changed, not because the politics disappeared, but because Adrian somehow made space around him feel safe. And she realized how long it had been since she'd felt emotionally safe with another adult. A cold breeze lifted strands of hair across her face. Adrian noticed her shiver slightly and removed his tuxedo jacket without hesitation. Adrian, you don't have to, Sophie. His tone was calm but firm. Take the jacket. She accepted it quietly, slipping the warm fabric over her shoulders. It smelled faintly like cedar and expensive cologne. Comforting, dangerous, human. They stood there together overlooking Manhattan while the ballroom music echoed faintly behind them. Then Adrian spoke again more quietly this time. Lily stopped speaking almost entirely after my wife passed away. Sophie turned toward him slowly. How old was she? 5. His jaw tightened slightly at the memory. Everyone kept telling her she needed to be brave for me. Sophie's chest ached instantly. Adrian stared out over the city lights. So she decided her feelings were a problem. Sophie closed her eyes briefly. God. She understood that too well. What changed Adrian's expression softened again. One afternoon, I found her sitting alone in the kitchen trying to make her own lunch because she thought I looked tired. His voice lowered further. That was the moment I realized children learn loneliness from adults. Sophie felt tears sting unexpectedly behind her eyes. Adrian glanced toward her carefully. You understand that feeling. It wasn't a question. Sophie looked down at the city below them. After my divorce, she admitted slowly, people kept telling me to stay strong for Noah. Her fingers tightened around the balcony railing, but nobody ever asked if I was okay. Adrian remained silent, giving her room instead of interrupting. Sophie continued quietly. I spent 2 years pretending everything was manageable. Her laugh broke slightly. Work, bills, school pickups, homework, being both parents all the time. She shook her head faintly. Eventually, you stop feeling like a person and start feeling like a machine that keeps other people alive. Adrian's eyes never left her face, and somehow that nearly undid her completely. Because he wasn't trying to fix her pain. He was simply willing to witness it. Sophie looked away quickly before emotion overwhelmed her. I'm sorry, she whispered automatically. Adrian sighed softly. Sophie. She laughed weakly through the tears threatening her eyes. I know. Adrian stepped slightly closer, though still careful not to invade her space. You don't have to earn kindness every second. The sentence hit her harder than anything else he'd said all night. because somewhere along the way she had started believing love itself was conditional on usefulness. The terrace doors suddenly opened behind them. Claire Whitmore stepped outside with two board members mid-conversation before stopping abruptly at the sight of Adrian and Sophie standing together alone beneath the city lights. The silence that followed was razor-sharp. Claire recovered first. "There you are, Adrian," she said smoothly. "The board's been waiting." Adrian didn't move immediately. "Then they should probably start without me." One of the board members exchanged an uncomfortable glance with Claire. Sophie instantly felt herself shrinking again beneath their collective judgment. Adrian sensed it immediately. Without looking away from Claire, he spoke softly toward Sophie. "Don't." Sophie blinked. What Adrian finally turned toward her fully. "Don't disappear just because other people become uncomfortable." The board members looked visibly awkward now. Claire's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Adrian offered Sophie his arm calmly. "Come on," he said. "I promised Lily I wouldn't stay at this party too long." Sophie hesitated. "You're leaving. Corporate events have an expiration date." A faint smile touched his mouth. Usually around the moment people start pretending they're not gossiping. Despite herself, Sophie laughed again. Adrian looked strangely satisfied by that. Claire stepped forward slightly. "Adrian, tomorrow's acquisition discussion can wait until tomorrow." His tone remained polite but final. Then he looked toward Sophie. "Can I drive you home?" Every instinct told Sophie this was dangerous territory. Not because Adrian seemed unsafe. Quite the opposite. He felt safe in ways she no longer trusted herself around. But another part of her, the exhausted, lonely part she spent years suppressing, desperately wanted a few more minutes in the presence of someone who saw her clearly. "Okay," she answered softly. Adrian nodded once, and together they walked back through the ballroom while conversations visibly stopped in their wake. Sophie felt every stare following them toward the exit. Yet strangely, the shame no longer crushed her the way it would have hours earlier. Because Adrian wasn't walking beside her like a man rescuing someone beneath him. He walked beside her like she belonged there. Outside, Manhattan glowed cold and silver beneath the winter night sky. Adrian's driver moved toward the car immediately, but Adrian shook his head lightly. "I'll drive tonight." The driver nodded and stepped away without question. Sophie settled nervously into the passenger seat of Adrian's dark Aston Martin while city lights streaked across the windshield. For several minutes they drove quietly through Manhattan traffic, yet the silence felt peaceful rather than strained. Finally, Adrian glanced toward her briefly. Hungry Sophie blinked in surprise. "What, I missed dinner because of the party?" A faint trace of humor entered his voice. "And I'm fairly certain you've survived entirely on champagne anxiety for the last 4 hours." Sophie laughed before she could stop herself. That accurate, painfully. 20 minutes later, they sat inside a tiny all-night diner in Brooklyn, completely hidden from the polished world of Bennett and Rowe. Sophie stared around in disbelief. "The CFO of a billion-dollar company eats here." Adrian loosened his tie slightly while scanning the menu. "The CFO of a billion-dollar company likes pancakes at midnight." Sophie smiled into her coffee cup. Something about seeing Adrian here without the ballroom, without the power, without the corporate mythology made him feel startlingly human. Then his phone buzzed. Adrian glanced down and his entire expression changed instantly. Softer. Warmer. He answered immediately. "Hey, Bug." Sophie looked down politely as he listened. Adrian smiled faintly. "No, I'm not home yet." Pause. "Because adults make bad decisions and throw long parties." Sophie heard a tiny laugh through the phone speaker. Adrian leaned back slightly. "Did you finish your science project?" Another pause. Then Adrian glanced toward Sophie unexpectedly. "Actually," he said into the phone, "I'm having pancakes with someone nice." Sophie nearly choked on her coffee. Adrian's eyes warmed with amusement. "Her name's Sophie." Another excited little voice responded through the speaker. Adrian laughed quietly. No, I'm not interrogating her for you right now. Sophie couldn't stop smiling. Adrian listened another moment before his expression softened deeply. I'll be home soon, Lily. Promise. He hung up gently. Sophie stared at him over the diner table. She sounds adorable. Adrian's face carried traces of lingering sadness beneath the affection. She saved my life without realizing it. Sophie understood exactly what he meant, because Noah had done the same for her. Adrian studied her quietly across the table. You're smiling more now. Sophie lowered her eyes shyly. Maybe because nobody here cares who belongs at which table. Adrian leaned back slowly, watching her with that same calm attentiveness that somehow saw straight through her defenses. No, he said softly. I think it's because you finally stopped feeling invisible and sitting there beneath the soft neon lights of a nearly empty Brooklyn diner. Sophie realized something terrifying and beautiful at the exact same moment. Adrian Cole was becoming the first person in years who made loneliness feel temporary. By Monday morning, the story had already spread through Bennett Rowe Holdings like a controlled fire nobody wanted to extinguish. Sophie felt it before she even stepped off the elevator onto the 32nd floor. Conversation stopping half a second too late, eyes lifting from computer screens. The subtle shift in silence that happens when people have spent the weekend discussing your name behind closed doors. Someone near the reception desk glanced at her, whispered something to a coworker, and quickly looked away. Sophie tightened her grip on her laptop bag and kept walking. The warmth she had carried home from that night with Adrian still existed somewhere deep inside her chest. But corporate environments had a way of punishing people for moments of happiness. Especially women. Especially single mothers. Especially women suddenly connected to powerful men. By the time she reached her office, 3 meetings had mysteriously disappeared from her calendar. A 4th invitation had been reassigned to another manager entirely. Sophie stared at the screen in confusion before opening her email. There it was. A message from Claire Whitmore sent at 6:12 that morning. Due to leadership restructuring, several project oversight responsibilities will be temporarily reassigned. Temporarily. Sophie almost laughed at the word. Corporate language was incredible that way. They could bury someone alive using polite vocabulary. Her phone buzzed seconds later. Megan from Analytics. You okay? Sophie stared at the message for several seconds before replying automatically. I'm fine. She hated how easily the lie came now. Across the office floor, she noticed people pretending not to watch her. But the whispers were impossible to miss. Did you hear she left with him? Apparently they were alone together all night. Claire's furious. Adrian Cole doesn't notice women like that unless something's going on. Sophie sat slowly at her desk and forced herself to breathe normally. She had known this would happen. Women inside powerful companies were never allowed innocent narratives. If a man succeeded, he was brilliant. If a woman gained attention from someone powerful, she must have manipulated it somehow. By noon, the isolation had become obvious enough that even junior employees noticed it. Nobody invited her to lunch. 2 department heads ignored her entirely during a strategy discussion she had originally designed herself. Worse ideas Sophie had spent months developing suddenly reappeared in meetings under other executives' names. Claire wasn't attacking openly. She was doing something far more effective, erasing her carefully. Sophie sat through the afternoon with growing humiliation tightening in her chest. Every old insecurity returned at once. Maybe this had been a mistake. Maybe Adrian's attention had only made her life harder. Maybe people like her really weren't supposed to step outside the invisible lines assigned to them. Around 4:30, she received a meeting request from Claire. Mandatory. Executive Conference Room B. Sophie stared at the screen for several seconds before closing her eyes briefly. The conference room felt colder than usual when Sophie arrived. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Manhattan, while a dozen executives sat around the polished black table pretending professionalism masked the tension in the room. Claire Whitmore stood near the presentation screen in an immaculate ivory suit composed as always. Adrian sat near the far end of the table reviewing financial documents with calm indifference. He looked up the second Sophie entered. Not dramatically, just enough for her to notice. And somehow that small acknowledgement steadied her heartbeat slightly. Sophie Claire said smoothly, "Thank you for joining us." Sophie sat quietly near the middle of the table while several executives avoided eye contact altogether. Claire folded her hands elegantly. There have been concerns raised regarding professional boundaries within leadership teams. Sophie felt heat rise instantly into her face. So this was happening publicly. Of course it was. Claire continued in the same measured tone. Bennett and Rowe takes workplace integrity very seriously. Sophie looked down briefly, humiliation pressing heavily against her ribs now. No matter how accomplished a woman became, society could still reduce her to implication within seconds. Adrian finally spoke without lifting his eyes from the financial report in front of him. "Interesting." Claire paused. "Excuse me?" Adrian looked up calmly. "I'm trying to understand how gossip became a measurable business concern." Silence spread instantly across the room. Claire's smile tightened. "This isn't about gossip, Adrian." "Then clarify the concern." His tone remained completely even. "Because from where I'm sitting, it sounds like a successful female employee is being questioned for having dinner with a colleague." One of the vice presidents shifted uncomfortably. Claire's expression sharpened slightly. "With respect, the issue is perception." Adrian leaned back slowly in his chair. Perception created by whom, nobody answered. Sophie stared at him in stunned silence. Most executives protected themselves first, always. Yet Adrian was placing himself directly into the line of fire without hesitation. Claire crossed her arms lightly. "This company values professionalism." Adrian nodded once. "Then perhaps we should discuss professional contributions." Sophie's pulse quickened. Claire narrowed her eyes slightly. Adrian closed the financial folder in front of him and slid another document onto the conference table. The Harrison Merger Recovery Strategy. Several executives immediately looked interested. The Harrison merger had nearly collapsed 6 months earlier before unexpectedly recovering at the last second. Claire straightened slightly. "What about it?" Adrian's gaze moved calmly toward Sophie. "Sophie designed the recovery structure." The room went silent. Claire blinked once. "That's not accurate." Adrian slid additional papers across the table. Time-stamped drafts, internal communications, original forecasting models. One by one, executives began reviewing the documents with growing confusion. Sophie stared at Adrian in shock. She had never shown him those files. Adrian continued calmly. "The same applies to the Morgan retention plan, the Westbridge restructuring proposal, and the Calder acquisition stabilization model." A vice president looked up sharply. "Wait, Sophie created the Calder framework." Adrian nodded. "Entirely." Sophie felt physically frozen now. Because those projects had transformed the company's financial position over the last 2 years. Yet Claire had presented most of them publicly as collaborative executive efforts. Claire recovered quickly. Sophie contributed to several team initiatives. "No," Adrian interrupted quietly. "She saved them." The words landed like a bomb inside the conference room. Sophie's throat tightened painfully. Nobody had ever said something like that about her before, not publicly, not in rooms that mattered. Claire's voice cooled several degrees. "Adrian, I think you're becoming emotionally compromised here." Adrian's expression didn't change. Emotionally compromised. His gaze moved slowly across the room. "No. I'm simply the first person at this table willing to acknowledge where the company's actual talent exists." The tension became suffocating. Sophie could barely breathe. Claire stepped closer toward the table. "This is highly inappropriate." Adrian folded his hands calmly. "You know what's inappropriate." His eyes finally locked fully onto Claire's. allowing a woman to carry failing divisions for 2 years while systematically denying her visibility because she doesn't fit the social architecture you prefer. Nobody moved. Nobody even looked away. Claire's mask finally cracked slightly. "You're making serious accusations." Adrian's voice remained terrifyingly calm. "No, I'm making documented observations." He pressed a button on the conference room remote. The presentation screen behind Claire lit up instantly with internal email chains. Sophie's stomach dropped. Timestamps, project drafts, approval notes, executive summaries. Her work, all of it clearly originating from her accounts months before being reassigned upward through leadership channels. Murmurs spread instantly around the table. One board member frowned deeply while reviewing the records. Claire. Why was Sophie's authorship removed from these reports? Claire's composure faltered for the first time. That was a formatting oversight. Adrian almost smiled. Repeatedly, another executive looked visibly disturbed now. These projections saved the Harrison merger. "Correct," Adrian said calmly. And Sophie worked 72 consecutive hours rebuilding them after the original leadership team failed. Sophie stared down at the table, emotion crashing violently through her chest now. She remembered those nights, sitting alone in the office at 2 in the morning while pumping herself full of coffee because Noah needed school supplies and she couldn't afford to lose the job. Nobody had thanked her afterward. Claire had simply presented the final solution to the board herself. Adrian continued quietly. "You know what fascinates me?" His gaze swept across the room. This company prides itself on innovation while repeatedly ignoring one of the most capable strategists inside the building because she doesn't network aggressively or attend golf retreats. Several executives now looked openly uncomfortable. Claire's control over the room was slipping visibly. Sophie could feel it happening in real time. The social hierarchy inside Bennett and Rowe had always operated like gravity, invisible but absolute. Yet suddenly the entire structure was beginning to tilt. Claire straightened sharply. "This is becoming personal." Adrian met her gaze evenly. "No. What became personal was watching talented people get buried alive while executives protected their own image." Silence crashed across the room again. Then, unexpectedly, one of the older board members spoke quietly. "Is it true?" Everyone looked toward him. His eyes settled directly on Sophie. "Did you build these strategies yourself?" Sophie's mouth went dry instantly. Years of invisibility had trained her not to occupy space in rooms like this, not to speak too loudly, not to claim too much credit. But Adrian's eyes found hers across the table. Calm, steady. Not rescuing her, simply reminding her she had the right to exist there. Sophie inhaled shakily. "Yes," she said softly. Nobody interrupted. She swallowed once before continuing. The Harrison merger was going to fail because the debt exposure model was inaccurate. Her voice strengthened slightly. "So I rebuilt the forecasting structure manually." One executive frowned. "That took our analysts weeks." Sophie nodded quietly. "I know." Another silence. Then another board member asked carefully, "Why didn't you say something earlier?" Sophie almost laughed at the painful simplicity of the question. Why didn't she say something? Because women like her learned early that survival depended on being agreeable. Because single mothers inside corporate environments were expected to be grateful just for inclusion. Because every time she tried speaking confidently, someone made her feel arrogant for it. Sophie looked down briefly before answering honestly. Because eventually you get tired of fighting to be seen. The room fell completely still. Even Claire had no immediate response to that. Adrian watched Sophie quietly, and for the first time since entering Bennett and Rowe, she realized nobody at that table felt sorry for her anymore. They looked stunned. Because the invisible woman they had ignored for years was suddenly impossible not to notice. Claire attempted one final recovery. Regardless of contribution levels, executive collaboration requires discretion and professionalism. Adrian stood slowly from his chair. The movement alone changed the atmosphere instantly. If professionalism means allowing talented people to be diminished for the comfort of insecure executives, he said calmly, then perhaps this company has confused hierarchy with leadership. Claire's face paled slightly. Adrian gathered his documents. Sophie deserves credit for work this company would have collapsed without. His gaze swept the room one final time. And frankly, the fact that this conversation is only happening because she attended one dinner with me says far more about this organization than it does about her. Nobody spoke. Nobody dared. Adrian looked toward Sophie, then his expression gentling almost invisibly. "You should stop apologizing for taking up space," he said quietly. The sentence hit harder than anything else that day. Sophie felt tears burn unexpectedly behind her eyes, but this time they weren't humiliation. They were grief, relief, exhaustion. Because after years of shrinking herself to survive, someone had finally turned on the lights in the middle of the room and forced everyone to see what had always been there. Claire Whitmore remained standing beside the glowing presentation screen while the power she had carefully controlled for years slipped visibly through her fingers. And for the first time since walking into Bennett Rowe Holdings, Sophie Bennett no longer looked invisible. The weeks after the boardroom meeting changed Bennett Rowe Holdings in ways people would talk about long after the scandal itself faded. Claire Whitmore quietly resigned before the internal investigation finished. Several executives who had spent years protecting silence suddenly became vocal supporters of inclusive leadership, though everyone knew the change came too late to erase what had already been exposed. But the biggest difference was Sophie. For the first time since joining the company, people stopped speaking over her in meetings. They stopped treating her ideas like background noise. Her name appeared on presentations now. Her voice no longer trembled when she spoke. And yet the strangest part was that none of those things mattered to her as much as she once thought they would. Because Adrian had given her something far more important than corporate recognition. He had forced her to see herself differently. One rainy Thursday evening, Sophie sat in the small auditorium of Noah's elementary school, watching children stumble through a spring music recital while exhausted parents filmed proudly from folding chairs. Noah stood near the center wearing a crooked bow tie and singing half a second behind everyone else. Sophie laughed softly to herself just as someone settled quietly into the empty seat beside her. She turned and found Adrian there holding 2 cups of coffee. "You're late," she whispered. Adrian handed her 1 cup calmly. "CFO emergency." Sophie raised an eyebrow. Adrian glanced toward the stage where Noah dramatically missed another note. "I chose the more terrifying boardroom." Sophie laughed under her breath while warmth spread quietly through her chest. Some things between them had changed slowly after that night at the diner. Adrian started showing up in ordinary moments instead of dramatic ones. Helping Noah build a science fair volcano at midnight, letting Lily and Noah destroy his apartment with pillow forts and art supplies, sitting beside Sophie in silence after difficult days without trying to fix her sadness. It wasn't loud love. It was steady love, the kind built carefully by 2 tired people who understood loneliness too well. As applause filled the auditorium, Adrian looked toward Sophie softly. "You know," he said, "Lily told me something yesterday." Sophie smiled faintly. "Should I be worried?" "Probably." His eyes warmed. "She said you walk differently now." Sophie blinked. What does that even mean? Adrian studied her quietly for a moment before answering. "She said you don't walk like someone apologizing anymore." The words hit Sophie so unexpectedly that her eyes immediately burned. She looked down at the coffee cup in her hands while emotion tightened painfully in her throat. For years, she had believed survival meant becoming smaller, quieter, easier to ignore. But somewhere between that ballroom dance and this ordinary school auditorium, she had started reclaiming parts of herself she thought were gone forever. Adrian reached over gently, his fingers brushing hers. "You know what the funny thing is?" he said softly. Sophie looked at him. Adrian's expression carried the same calm honesty that had changed her life the night they met. "I thought I was helping you that night at the party." His thumb moved lightly against her hand. "Turns out you were saving me, too." Sophie felt tears finally slip free then, but this time they weren't born from humiliation or loneliness. They came from something quieter, healing. Because this was never only a love story about a powerful man noticing a forgotten woman. It was about two exhausted single parents teaching each other that dignity mattered more than status. That kindness could be rebellion. That being truly seen by another human being could change the entire shape of your life. On stage, Noah spotted Sophie in the crowd and waved enthusiastically. Beside him, Lily waved too. Adrian laughed softly while Sophie smiled through tears. And for the first time in many years, neither of them felt invisible anymore.